Everyone's aware of that. Yeah, so as I was saying, if anyone had any questions or anything, I could address those because I'll be able to see that on this screen, and I'm screen sharing on this other big window here. So yeah, so some other general orientation stuff. This is a co-vibing workshop, calling it pretty playfully, where we're going to be sharing best practices for using AI for workspace management. Taking notes. So that could be for software development, it could be for knowledge management, for various other projects people are working on. I know pretty much everyone here, so I know people are working on things that can potentially benefit from this kind of workspace management methodology. And a lot of it's still actively in flux. I mean, it seems like Cursor and a lot of these tools are evolving pretty rapidly. Like every week there's some update that changes something on an architectural level for how these things work. But it's very powerful in that it can enable people like myself without a background in software development to actually be able to make software. And it gets into this whole like home cooked software kind of barefoot developer territory, where people who otherwise may have been limited by that barrier to entry for software development can now actually start expressing themselves in these exciting new ways. So I'm going to share a couple workspaces and workflows for a couple different projects, very different things, and how they both use Cursor as like an integrated workspace management / assistant that can kind of expand the capabilities and the intelligence of the user into more technical ways and kind of like expand your antenna. Or like how I mentioned earlier, a friend of ours, Gabriel Chartier, used the term cognitive prosthetic. So that's sort of philosophically what characterizes a lot of this methodology. So the first one, and there will be bugs abound here. First one is using Cursor for creating a desktop typography app. So let me open that up. And I'll focus in on the particular window here so it's easier to see. Staging share. Okay. So this is Cursor, this window here. It's a fork of VS Code. Yeah. Barefoot cognitive prosthetics. It's a fork of VS Code that has this built-in chat interface here, and you can select models that you're using, and it's kind of an overwhelming interface. I mean, it took me a while as a non-developer to get used to the amount of stuff going on in this window, but I do think that what I'm hoping people will start walking away from is that this, like, you don't have to use this. A lot of this stuff pertains just to software development and kind of coding stuff, but you can kind of use this as a workspace management tool if you just know what to ignore and what to use. But the basic thing is here, you're able to access this whole directory of files. And again, this can be a repository for some software that you're working on, or it's just a knowledge base, a digital garden. I'll show an example of what that looks like later. I'm starting with this example of a software project, and then I'll go to an example of a digital garden and how you can use this tool in both contexts, kind of with a similar methodology. But the main things I'm going to be highlighting first are a particular arrangement for setting up this workspace to help the Cursor code assistant know how best to engage with the files in this workspace. And a lot of the stuff is Cursor specific, but the sensibility, I think, can generalize to other ways of other like proprietary code assistant software platforms. Again, like I mentioned, Roo, a friend just suggested that one, ROO, as an extension to VS Code. There's Tabby, which I think is an open source, more local first one. I haven't tried that. That's a direction I'm interested in moving. So if anyone has experience with like open source, local first alternatives to Cursor, I'd be interested in that because I think that would be really powerful. I think there's still some kind of trust risks associated with using something like this. Cursor says they don't store your data, but they temporarily store like the indexes of it, the semantic indexes, because it involves you either indexing your whole workspace here, your whole code base or workspace, and then Cursor is able to work with that. So there's some settings where you can configure some of this stuff, but the point is I personally would be interested in moving toward an arrangement whereby it's a bit less, it involves less trust on a SaaS company. But for the purposes of Cursor, which I do find really useful, I think it's been an amazing tool to get used to using. I'm paying $196 annually for a Cursor subscription, and that's been like, yeah, exactly. Keith's point there. I feel like it's even if they're well intentioned and aligned, there's just certain imperatives working on these companies that almost inevitably put them against the interest of users that really care about owning and protecting their data. So again, Cursor is an amazing tool, so I would recommend it. I think it's arguably the best $200 I've ever spent. And hopefully I'll convey why in this. And so I'm going to show the particular setup of rules that I have in Cursor, essentially as a configuration, like a workspace configuration arrangement. So Cursor uses these files here, MDC files. I forget what it stands for. I don't think it's a Cursor proprietary thing. My guess is that it's some variation of Markdown. But the point is that Cursor uses these rules as very granular, targeted configuration files where you're able to say, like when you can specify how Cursor should deal with certain files. So I say like everything in the Cursor/docs directory should be dealt with in this way. And the general approach I take there is I keep reference documentation, architectural documentation, things that are kind of outside of the project itself, but constitute some kind of scaffolding around the project. And I feel like that as an approach has been useful. I think I even use the term scaffolding here, and I kind of try to instill that into the assistant, thinking that everything in this Cursor directory, including documents and rules and various single purpose scripts, constitute a scaffolding around the project and aren't actually part of the project itself, but are just kind of useful. It's a combination. You can, yeah, Keith asks, is it about how the files are handled or how they fit into the context? It's both. You can say like when you're dealing with these files, behave this way, and you can also say how they relate to other files. So this is one thing I do here where like for a lot of these, I'd say up to here, everything like 27 and above are like general purpose Cursor workspace rules that you can kind of plug and play into pretty much whatever you're doing in Cursor. And then I have a bunch of rules after that that are specific to the particular project I'm working on. And I'll get into the Keith's question there about establishing context. The technique I use for mapping all of these out is putting them all in one big markdown file. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of this stuff in like a repo people can just copy to get the boilerplate rules, which I think can help, again, pretty much any general purpose project that you're doing. But I have a basic logic here that I found from some user on a Cursor forum where you apply a three-digit number before each rule, and then a basic kind of hierarchy of the more general purpose rules are near the lower end of that number spectrum, and the more specific ones are the higher numbers. And if there's a conflict between them, treat the more specific one as being the source of truth. And that's been useful so far. And then that reasoning is made explicit in this document. And I believe in here too. Yeah, so rule categories, and you can change all these things, but it's a neat way to give you a lot of flexibility into particular targeted configuration parameters you have for Cursor. Again, a lot of this is specific to Cursor. Maybe there are other code assistant IDEs or workspace tools that have a similar arrangement or a different arrangement. But I think like a sensibility wise, learning how to engage with a code assistant in this very targeted way has been helpful for me, especially when it involves dealing with a lot of file types and technical processes that I just totally don't understand. So I've got this basic list of rules here, and then I have each one of these rules staged here. So I've got this 001 workspace where I describe like the basic orientation of the workspace and the clear separation between the actual project files and then the .cursor directory, which is like a scaffolding. So I have this file, this exact file staged right here, mostly one to by having all of these rules staged in the same file. It's easier, I think it's easier for the code assistant to just look at this one file and have a very high level overview of how all these rules relate to one another than if you were to ask it to read every single one of these. So I'll show you, because then it would go through this process of like reading this file, then reading this, and then sometimes there's like a timeout if it does that too many times in a row. So I think it's a nice workaround is having all of these things staged in one big file where it can have a high level overview of how these rules work together. And the other benefit, and this seems like more of a bug than a feature for Cursor, is that if you ask Cursor to change one of these rules, last I tried to do that, it wasn't able to, and maybe that'll be addressed in some update, or maybe it's been addressed in a recent update and I just haven't tried it again. But if I wanted to change any one of these rules, Cursor just isn't able to change it in a way that actually registers in how the user interface displays it. So what I do, which is kind of a manual workaround, is I have it if I wanted to change one of these rules, I have it change the rule in this staging document. So if I say, oh, actually, we're changing some of the purposes of this workspace, I would like you to adjust the workspace rule so that in future conversations, your understanding of the workspace is on the same page as my understanding, and I wanted to change this workspace.mdc rule, I would have it change it in this staging document, and then I would manually copy it into this, and then resync the index, and now the code assistant should have a more up-to-date understanding or set of bearings for how to engage with this workspace. And then that's an example of that rule file pertaining to the workspace at large. And then to Keith's question earlier about how to contextualize rules and certain treatment of files within a larger project, you can get very specific with some of these. So this is, I'll give another example. So in this particular workspace is for making a font creation tool. And I'll give a brief little window of what that looks like, just for the purposes of illustrating how you can use these cursor rules. I'm making a desktop app for making fonts. So it's kind of like if anyone's used Font Forge. Oh, I think I have something else running. Well, actually, here's a good example of troubleshooting this. I don't know what's going wrong right here. So what I'm going to do is just copy all of this, start a new chat, and say, please help me fix this issue with the npm run dev command. And then I paste that there. And if you're pasting large chunks, it shows up as an attachment there. You can also attach other files. Like I want it to have this in its context window, what this project is all about. And I want it to have the high level description in the staging document here. So now in its context window is this staging document where it'll be able to have a high level understanding of how these rules connect. And this is a pretty long file, but it should be able to like pick out what is relevant within this file for the purposes of this prompt. So, and about choosing which model, I'm still kind of on the fence, and I don't know anything architecturally about these models. I usually go with this. This Gemini 2.5 Pro has been really useful, but it rate limits you unless you have your own API key, and I don't. So I normally go with Claude 3.5 Sonnet. 3.7 seems a bit unwieldy, and that could just be because I need to adjust my prompting strategy. Again, I have no idea how these things work architecturally, but I'll give it this, and it's in agent mode right now, so it is able to queue up edits to documents. So let's see if this is able to solve this issue. So what's supposed to happen down here is when I press npm run build, it should open up a little like a testing window of the app that I'm making, this font development app. So I think I just already have something else running. Let me try that. Yeah, well, part of Eric's question there, yeah, I'm only half joking as well. I definitely say please and thank you for existential reasons. Okay. So if I do run command, let's see this. So I think I just have something else running on that port, which is preventing the app from showing up in the dev mode there. Let's see if that solved it. And like this seems like a pretty basic literacy issue that I just don't understand what was happening there, but it seems like it's pretty readily able to solve a lot of those issues. And yeah, here we go. So now I'll switch to the window of the app, show what's going on there. Okay. Yes, not knowing is the essence. Yeah, we're kind of operating in the known unknown. I like to think like you have a sense of what it is you don't know, and how the AI assistant does know it. And I think this is like it's kind of expanding what you're able to operate in despite not knowing it. No, here we go. So this is now like the development mode of this app, calling Runique font making app. And so I have it constructed as like, oh, there's all these UI modules. Here's a canvas where you can draw things. Here's the toolbar. You can select different tools like for vector creation stuff. Here's a gallery where you can select your previous font projects. And all these things load up. You can just select all these things and edit. These are all paths you can edit and then export as a font, essentially. And so this is kind of a pet project. I mean, I am really passionate about fonts, but it's also a pet project for learning how to use Cursor effectively, especially for things that I wouldn't be able to get nearly this far, or at least I would have had to have had years of software development experience to get to this point. But thanks to Cursor, I've been able to do it in 2 months. So there's all this stuff, and this is the development mode. And again, there's a lot of basic stuff about software development that I still don't really understand. And another benefit to Cursor and these tools like this is that they can help you learn along the way, especially if you're patient. So this is something where like there's a development version of this and a production version of this. There's a lot of basic stuff between those processes I don't really understand yet. But the point is I wanted to show you that there's like this basic component of a canvas here, then a gallery module and a font tester module and whatnot, and a toolbar module. So now if I switch back to the Cursor window, I can show you this. So I mentioned there's a lot of general purpose Cursor rules files, like pretty much everything 27 and up, and everything 62 down is very specific to this particular project. So I've got an MDC file specifically for the Canvas module, because I got the sense that this is a complex but still discrete enough thing that warrants its own treatment description and parameters for like how these files related to this one thing should be treated within the context. And this is all a roundabout way of addressing Keith's questions about establishing integrations and context. And so here what I have is, for this particular file relating to the Canvas module, I have some description of integration points that relate to other files and how the Canvas module, how the canvas.ts module here, how this is the main file for the Canvas. It's this long thing full of stuff I don't understand, but I understand enough what it does in the high level architecture to troubleshoot it and make it basically functional. And so I specify in the cursor rule, like, oh, there's this file canvas.ts has a certain here, a certain context within the project, and it relates to these other tools in different ways, like whatever glyph is detected in the gallery module is also displayed in the Canvas module. So a lot of this stuff is very project specific technical descriptions of these very, very targeted rules and what they pertain to and the context of what they pertain to. And I feel like this has been really useful because before I started implementing these very targeted MVC rules, Cursor would invariably fly off the rails once the project got complex enough. But now, when I prompted about something, yeah, to Kristen's point, for the most part, yeah, I had Cursor write these rules. I would say like, yeah, the process for having Cursor write the rules, I would say go to 000 rules staging and stage a new rule according to the rule framework logic described at the top, describing this particular aspect of the project. And then stage this. And another useful thing, which also requires patience, is like, ask me questions about how this should be staged. Like, ask me questions about this task before you execute it. In this case, the task would be creating another little blurb, like one of these, for a particular rule. And then it would do that, and then usually it does it very well if you give it the right context and the right information. And then I would copy it in and then like tweak certain things. But for the most part, I'm having Cursor write all of its own rules according to just high level guidance. Yeah, Ben?
Yeah, you already kind of started to go down this path, but I'm wondering if maybe you could go at a high level, like tip to toe the process where like you first have an idea and then do you like interact with Cursor to help create the initial set of rules that define like the features and like, and then how do you get into like the weeds of the like, specific specification, technical specifications? Like, because I wouldn't even know, similar to you, I wouldn't even know like, do I need a database for this? And how do I like, I don't even know enough about software architecture to know what I don't know. So how do you like work with the whole process of collaborating with Cursor to create things in what sequence?
Okay, so this is great, and I actually have a little task I can like run through here for like starting from zero. So if I open up another one, projects, resources, template, workspace. Okay, so this is kind of a general purpose workspace that I use to like seed new projects, like before they warrant their own repository or anything. So like one of them was like I wanted it to do some research for me on like how I could set up my own local first stack. And so like in that case, what I did was And another useful tool is this spec story integration for Cursor. It exports your chats as markdown files. So you now have like a history, these things. I might not have the one I'm looking for here. Yeah, here. So here's one example. I don't know what this is. There's one thing. So I said, like, it's starting out in like at 0 for a particular inquiry or project. I said, please create a comparative research document in the research folder to compare the following open source or self-hosted code assistant models. I want to identify a viable setup for self-hosting a performant local code assistant. Please research these models and others, and we will progress to researching hardware options to run models locally, just a typo. Use these tools to search the web. And so there's a couple tools. There's a built-in web searching functionality. But if you like, sometimes you can be a bit more granular. You can have it use a web scraping tool or some search engine tool. But generally, I'd say just typing, when you type web in your prompt, it'll search the web and find results and use those. And that's really helpful too, just as like a research assistant. So like in this case, when I gave it this prompt and I gave it these links saying, look into Tabby, look into some other code assistants, it gave me this response. It then created the research directory, which I hadn't already made. And then it used a web scraper tool to look at those URLs and some other ones. And then there's some other back and forth here. I had to install some other library for it to use those tools. I think you could have just bypassed this and just used the web tag in the prompt, and just given it this prompt and then used like @web, and it would have been able to do it just as effectively. But then the long and the short of it is, it then created this document, and then I like refined it a bit more by asking it to elaborate on certain parts, and then look at other resources or put in some other tables and stuff here. Stuff like this, where it compared some of these other models. And this is like 20, 30 minutes of work, putting all this stuff together. And then it gives you like a pretty comprehensive layout of this stuff. There's still some issues. Like I'm always, when it involves researching stuff on the web, I usually have to remind it, like, don't hallucinate, or like, don't add fluffy information to this, and provide citations and links in markdown format. And it seems like a lot of it is it defaults to these like neat bullet point sections of just like 4 bullet points in a section. And it seems like, or how artificial is that? Or are you just like adding in another bullet point to make it 4 bullet points? So there's some kind of prompting strategy there that, like, that's a big limiting factor, is like how effectively you're prompting this. And again, I have no idea how these different models work architecturally. It seems like I'm at the point now where if I switch models, I can tell like, oh wow, this thing is responding in a totally different way, and I have no idea why. And I've kind of settled into an equilibrium using Claude 3.5, which doesn't necessarily mean that's the most effective one for these purposes, but that's just what I'm used to. So like, this is one really limited example of going from 0 to finished. If finished is just, you now have this document. A slightly more ambitious one, which I did a couple days ago, is this, where I had it take this. So another useful thing here. So spec story as an integration is really useful. Lets you export the chats as markdown files. Another useful thing is git ingest. So if you go to any GitHub repo and go to the URL and just change GitHub to git ingest, you're able to download large swaths of that repository as a markdown file. So what I did was I went to this repo. You go to the top here. This is a text-based user interface or command line interface for Blue Sky, to make posts to Blue Sky from the command line. And I wanted to integrate this with Quartz so that when you write a new article to Quartz, and I'll get into what this looks like too, for Quartz, when you write a new article in Quartz, you can then stage a post to Blue Sky that automatically pulls the title and the subtitle and the tags and the URL from that Quartz post, and then just posts it to Blue Sky on your behalf. And you can then elaborate on that to build it into certain processes and everything. And this is like, this was done, and it, I think, more or less works. I'll show how it works. But this is an example of here, integrating, no, this one. Actually, yeah, I think in terms of the chat history, I started this with a command line interface for Farcaster, but I was having a little bit of trouble with that. And at some point in this conversation, I pivoted to Blue Sky and just said, like, I referenced this Git ingest document to give it the context of what this Blue Sky library does. And then it said, okay, so it had the context of that. It prompted me to install that library to start using it. And then it also created this scoping document here. Where is it? Here. So yeah, that's normally what I have it do to start, is create a scoping document and then refine that a bit. Like again, ask me questions about any areas of this scoping document that you think are unclear or potentially problematic, and then we'll address those. And a lot of the time, what I find really funny is a lot of this is like 2-3 degrees farther of having it guide itself. So like a lot of the stuff I wouldn't know how to create a document like this, but just by asking it to ask clarifying questions and then telling it to use its own best judgment to solve those questions seems to be really good for creating these scoping documents. And then you just reference the scoping document as a plan or an outline for doing whatever it is you want to do. And in this case, it's pretty self-contained. In this case, it just created a single script. It's not here. I think what I did was I took that scoping document and brought it into the Knowledge Garden, which I'll show here. I'll show you how it works, which I think is pretty cool. Yeah. Okay. So now this is the repo for my website /Quartz Knowledge Garden. And I brought in the script that was just created by that workflow there. And that's what this is here, stage bluesky.ts. So that scoping document I just shared, which I think I put in cursor temp. Where did I put that? I don't know, somewhere in here. I had that document that I just showed you about scoping out what the Blue Sky Quartz integration would be. I used that as essentially a prompt itself to create this script, which then takes takes everything it needs to take from that Blue Sky command line interface repo thing, and then integrate it with Quartz. And again, the useful thing there is like always having documentation on hand to describe the systems that you're working with. And so in this case, I have a very lengthy Quartz architecture document where I essentially just aggregated all of the documentation from the default Quartz repo into one big thing. And again, sometimes these big documents are kind of unwieldy, but they're also useful to just like say, if you're looking for something about how this system works, there's a good chance it's in this document, and just tagging it or pointing out that it should look there if the code assistant is looking for certain information about an existing tool or system. So I've got that for Quartz. And then I had another one that I just showed everyone for scoping out what that Blue Sky integration would look like. And then I had both of those to create this document here. So let me see if I can go back to here. This is the chat for implementing the command line tool for Blue Sky. So if I go all the way to the beginning of this, yeah, there we go. So I have, please look at this markdown document, which would describe how a tool like this Blue Sky thing would integrate with Quartz, and prepare to implement it as a tool I can use from the command line. And I also wanted it to ask me or to tell me how to use it with my Blue Sky credentials, because that's, again, like another basic thing that I don't understand. But if you just ask it, it'll tell you how to do it. And so I got like my Blue Sky password and everything there. And I made like you can make a special tool integration password for platforms like Blue Sky. And again, here it's another reason why I'd prefer to have a local first version is so that you don't have to be as concerned with security things like dealing with environment variables and passwords and whatnot. But I went through this whole conversation and it created it very quickly. I think this conversation happened over the course of maybe 2 hours. And so now when I run this, it should open up a little interface for me here, which allows me to select which article from my website I want to have staged into a Blue Sky post. Oh, here, I didn't copy the full thing. Actually, that's not what I wanted to do. Here. Do that. Yeah, it's not as, here, I'll just do this. So what this integration does within Quartz, and this pertains to a lot of the knowledge commenting things we're discussing in these organizations, lets you specify a directory in your website. So I'll say this is the folder where I have my articles writing. And then there's a selection here where I say I can pick one of these articles. And all of these are markdown files with pretty extensive front matter. And I can say, like, I'll go with this article. So I press enter, and then it takes this information from that article, the title. Here, I'll just pull it up as well. In the content writing here. So I specified this article to stage as a Blue Sky post. And this is the article up here on the top, the markdown, including the title, which it pulls. This Blue Sky Quartz integration script pulls the title from the front matter of the selected article, the subtitle here, the URL that ends up being generated. And this was a problematic bit too. There's like, I wanted to make sure that the W is actually lowercase. I ran into this whole thing. So I'll troubleshoot that live, and then the tags that are listed here as well. So now when I press yes, it'll send this as a Blue Sky post, but because the W right here is uppercase, the link won't work. So what I'm gonna do is ask it to fix this script, this Blue Sky integration script, such that the folder names in writing, whether it's writing or Zettelgarten, are always lowercase, because then the links will work, and that should make this work. So I'm going to ask it to do that. I'm going to say there is an issue with Blue Sky, stage Blue Sky, the script, where the folder name in which the specified file is contained is uppercase, such as the W in writing. Let's see if I can just copy this so it knows exactly what I'm talking about. I'm going to give this as a very explicit example of what's wrong and what I'm trying to fix. The W in writing in the following URL, but the folder needs to be lowercase, AE writing. Please let me fix this issue. Because right now it would work. This would make a Blue Sky post, but the link wouldn't work because the W is capitalized. And I had to go into the whole Quartz architecture and like manually enforce lowercase letters and folders in URL slugs. So that was like a big detour from creating this Blue Sky script. So now let's see if it did it. I see the issue. The problem is in our URL handling. We need to make the folder names lowercase and the URL not uppercase. So it made this change. And the way Cursor handles this is because I have the settings configured such that it can make changes. It just went ahead and changed this, but I can undo that change by pressing reject. But like right now, the change is made to the code base, and I can just confirm it, which would make it no longer pending in this UI. If I go to the actual file that it's changing, it added this bit, and it added this bit, and it removed this. So like right now, these changes have already happened, but the Cursor UI allows me to like undo it in a user-friendly way. But I'm just gonna go with it. So I'll accept it, and then we'll see if this works. So I'm gonna run it again. So if it works, that means I'm gonna go through this process again, and the W should be lowercase. I'm gonna cancel this, and then try it again. Writing. I'm gonna select the same one. Oh, someone saying something. See, there's a question.
That was from long ago.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I was focused. This is awesome, but
yeah, feel free to like raise a hand because then I'll hear a little beep or something. Okay, so I'm gonna select this one again. And we'll see if that worked. Cool. Yeah. Again, and yeah, it made the lowercase W here. So now when I press yes, this will make a Blue Sky post. Do that. So now if I go there, I'll switch windows to Blue Sky. We'll see if that did anything. So share.
Spencer, Glenn's got a question when you get a pause.
Oh yeah, here, I'll just show that the result of this and then I'll address that. So yeah, so it just made this post for me. So now you can potentially build this into Quartz and everything. And it's also like a nice, pretty simple example of like what finished looks like for a project and using Quartz, like creating that initial scoping document, bringing in any other kind of reference documentation, like for Quartz can be pretty complex. So if you have documentation explaining how the code assistant should understand Quartz, you reference that, and then you just iterate a bit by testing it out, and then be very specific and unambiguous with what you'd like it to change, and it can do stuff like this very quickly. And someone have a question? Let's see.
Oh, yeah, I had one question here just now. So as I think about the instructions you're giving us as to how to translate some project idea you have into the form that Cursor can digest and then create a project from, I immediately start thinking about how do those could those instructions themselves be templatized such that we can abstract away from the command line, and when I want to do this same, hey, I want to post from my blog to the, have it immediately post to Blue Sky. All of this has been part of the context of an agent that I use. And so, yeah, just curious how you think about abstracting your. So what does a Spencer agent look like of what you're doing here?
Well, the closest I've done there so far is just making a lot of the stuff in the Cursor rules and documentation generalizable. And so there's still some like what you could do is like this is a much simpler Cursor rules setup than the typography app, which got a few here. Like it's not as intensive. But what you could do to your point of making this process a bit more like off the shelf is you can have a document that says something like scoping document creation or something like that. And you can have instructions there for how the code assistant should take your initial project inquiries or ideas and elaborate them into a scoping document that can then be a much more robust point of departure for actually starting to build the project. So I think that's one of the other learnings here is if you just start, it can be generative, but you can very easily go off the rails and then create a bunch of bloat and noise that can be difficult to backtrack from without just refreshing. But I think that's where my mind would go is like templatize the process of creating a scoping document within the context of these other general purpose rules, like how cursor should stage new rules, how cursor should understand different types of documents here. Like I have temporary documents. Like sometimes if I'm just trying to fix a bug, I say create a temporary document where you outline, where you analyze what's going wrong and suggest some paths forward. Oh yeah, Ben?
Oh, you kind of just answered it in terms of going like debugging. Like, do you go from the specification document and then it tries to write the entire thing in one go, and then you spend time like module by module troubleshooting? Yeah, what is that process like?
For the most part, yeah. I'll switch back to the other typography repository because I've got a ton of very temporary documents there that have been like just specific to solving problems like this and debugging. So if I go back here, anything else, window, staging, okay. So I've got all the rules here in docs in this temp folder. I've got all of these. Oh, and yeah, and then I also have archive, like all these other previous like debugging temporary documents that I had it right, where I would, it would create these pretty elaborate outlines of what's going wrong in a particular issue. And I think it's good because it kind of splits up the process of analyzing or like diagnosing and then executing into like a separate sequential process so that it's not having to like constantly be pulling in context as it's executing fixes. So I think that's been some of the problems I've encountered is when I prematurely have it start to try to fix things, especially with complex projects, it would forget that this other important file exists. And it would like reinvent some duplicating script or section that then is like competing with the existing thing that's already way more well-defined and elaborated. So like doing a thorough kind of push on like analyze the existing architecture of the project, analyze the integration points, and that's where this stuff is important within each cursor rules. Like if you go to, like say I'm having a problem with the canvas, the drawing canvas in the typography app, I would say like, I'm experiencing this issue where like when I draw a shape and then press save, the shape disappears. And I would give it some error logs as context, and I would tag this file, the canvas file, as a maintain, like remember this problem within the context of this particular module and how it integrates with other files. And this, I think, is what has enabled me to have the success I've had with the typography app as someone who doesn't fundamentally understand what's going on with the project. Is then when I reference this file, it's then able to see very specifically how it relates to other files in the code base in ways that I don't understand. And so then it's like it kind of immediately gets a footing and then sees all the different ways that its footing is connected within a larger project, rather than what I had been previously doing, which is just starting to fix the bug, because then it's like it doesn't have any kind of footing at all. And so it's like you're providing this kind of context by explicitly pointing to kind of a signpost like this, where like for the location of this file, it relates to this file in this way and that file in that way in very explicit ways. And I think that's what enables this to work, as well as like very explicit pointers and descriptive relations between the problematic file and its related files. Because like, yeah, if I don't do that, then it's like, it usually ends up making the problem worse. And I usually just need to like revert back, which is also really useful because I'm able to, like say in this conversation, I can revert back to a previous stage. So like that's another useful thing sometimes, is like kind of doing reconnaissance. Like if I don't really understand what the problem is, I can just ask it to throw stuff at the wall and see if anything sticks. And when usually nothing sticks, I can revert back to when I asked that question, but now I have a bit more context and I can prompt it a bit more incisively. And so sometimes I've been able, for particularly tricky issues that are like far beyond my understanding, I've been able to do that a few times. And then through that process, I'm learning how to better phrase the prompt. Because like sometimes the tactic of having it prompt itself isn't effective. Like sometimes you don't need to really understand what's going on, but sometimes you do, at least in my experience. Like if I have zero understanding of how this stuff works, I can only ask it to prompt itself so well. So like being able to revert back has been really useful. Yeah. Yeah, definitely for me at least, as a learning process, if nothing else. So I can try. Does anyone have any other questions on this? The next thing I was going to do is to try to do a thing like the Blue Sky integration, but with Farcaster, and then try to marry them such that I can pick an article and have a Blue Sky post and Farcaster post staged in parallel, and then send them both. But does anyone have any questions on any of this stuff before we move forward? Okay. See if I'm missing anything in the chat. All right. See you, rather. Oh, I mean, I guess before that, I can show how you can use this in ways that really don't have anything to do with software or like coding. So I'll switch back to the Knowledge Garden, Knowledge Garden 1. See you guys. Quick, something else. Stage Blue Sky. Okay, so this, like from a knowledge management perspective, this is mostly. Oh, I keep clicking on the preview screen in Google Docs. Okay. This is mostly just a repository of like articles and stuff. So I could, and also some reference texts. Like I've got whole books in here. Got Wealth of Nations as a markdown file, which is cool. So I can say I wanted to ask something about Wealth of Nations. Let's see how well it could actually parse that out. Let's see. From a writing / research perspective, you can approach it as here, let me do a new one. Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. Okay. I wrote this article. I'll tag something that I wrote that obliquely references the subject matter. And I'll say, like, please identify instances where inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, or I'll just say nations, refutes or disproves claims I make in my post. And so like I could send this, but my suspicion is that the Wealth of Nations markdown file is like way too big. So what I could do instead is kind of give this as a sample prompt and instead prompt it to create a process for handling these extensive research prompts. So we can see where that goes. Let's see. just frame this prompt itself as like some kind of argument. I'll say, given the following research prompt, I would like to develop a well-defined and flexible process for research related queries involving long markdown documents within the context of my knowledge base. C, Quartz architecture for context about the technical architecture of this knowledge base, and then create a guide document in this directory, cursor/docs/temp. I'll just do docs. Describing how best to facilitate these requests. Feel free, I'll say, please search the web. This is another interesting thing. If you have a sense that there may already be some technical standard for what you're trying to do, you can have it look for existing technical standards. And I think that's been really successful. If we have time after this, people aren't totally fed up, I can show an example of how that's been useful. Please search the web for any relevant resources or technical standards relating to this desired document. And then oddly enough, and I don't know if I've just convinced myself that this works, but sometimes it feels like it works when I ask, does this make sense? And let me add, please, so I don't get tortured for eternity. So it's generating. Actually, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to switch to Gemini. So I think I haven't used up my requests for today. It seems to be really good at these like extensive, complex requests. It seems to be better than Claude 3.5, but I get limited based on how I'm able to use this. Yeah, I'm going to edit this and then send it again with a different model.
Spencer, I have a quick question while we're waiting.
Yeah, sure.
If you want to like do this whole process, but want to use, like I have the pro version of Claude and GPT that I've trained and it has my, the memory in there. Can you get an API to that? Or are you getting API access to the general model?
I'm not sure. I know if you go to settings here, if you can see cursor settings, see this? Yeah. Okay. So if you go to models, you can select ones that you want to be available for listing, and you can also put in API keys. I'm not sure if that, like how that works with custom models. I haven't used custom models, but this might be able to work for that.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
It's definitely, I can also just ask it. Let's see. Let's see what it's doing over here. Okay. So it oriented itself with what Quartz is pretty quickly and effectively. A guide outlining process for research inquiries involving long markdown documents within your Quartz setup. a case study. Okay, this guide. So this guide is outlining a process, a generalized process whereby I can ask it these extensive semantic search research questions that probably involve a lot of reasoning. And I don't know if all these models are equipped for that. But it's like as an example of setting some kind of standardized technical process to facilitate future requests rather than doing each one on like an ad hoc basis. This seems to be a good example. Let me see what Ben just said. Oh, you can't. Yeah, to Crystal's point. Yeah. Right. So let's look at the document it created here. I click on this. Conducting research inquiries within Quartz knowledge base. So this doesn't. I mean, there's probably some good stuff here. This is also the sort of thing that, like, I think to an extent you can have documents like this that just are plain language guidelines for how a code assistant should execute a certain type of request. But I'm not quite sure how good of an example this is. But I think the point I was trying to make is that you can use it to help you with tasks that aren't just coding in nature. So like another very plain example is proofreading. You can proofread a document pretty effectively. Like say, oh yeah, see Kristen. Say please proofread prospectus and correct any typos or syntactical errors. In the past, it's been able to do this pretty quickly. So just it's reading this. Okay, yeah. And it identified the things that aren't perhaps like wouldn't be immediately evident, like syntactical errors in a writing document. Yeah, so like there's various changes here that like I didn't notice when I wrote this. I didn't know there were all these typos. So if I click on this, let's see what's happening. So yeah, so it stages all of these changes that are kind of like slightly more complex than maybe certain automated syntax error detection would be able to detect. But then again, I'd imagine a lot of that stuff's using AI now too. So this is useful to have AI like do a final pass on something that doesn't involve changing the substance of a piece of writing, but can just fix all these things. Yeah, and they all seem to make sense in how it lays them all out. So like that's another really easy example that just took like 10, 15 seconds for it to read that, spit out all those things. Oh, see you, Christy. But yeah, that's you can kind of see where you can use this in like non-programming ways as well for knowledge management and editorial stuff. Any of you have any other questions or things to share? It seems like we've covered quite a bit.
No, I got to run too, Spencer, but thank you so much. You fried my brain cells very well. I'll have lots of questions later.
Perfect.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah, I'm hoping.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer.
Of course. Thank you all for joining. I'll be sharing any kind of like copy paste kind of boilerplate repo you can use, like the Quartz. I mean the cursor rules, stuff like that. A lot of that's pretty general purpose, so I'll circulate all that stuff around as well.
Thank you.
Cool.
Bye.
I'll talk to you guys later.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.